Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And I'm joined today by James Phillips, a lawyer and writer, to discuss his new book, Two Revolutions and a Constitution, which is an exploration of really kind of the long roots of the US Constitution and the development of the constitutional government in America as a result of the long 17th century in England, in Britain, and the Civil War and the Glorious Revolution. But it goes further back than that. But anyway, I'm not going to carry on telling the story of the book because I'm going to introduce James now and invite him to tell us a little bit about the book and its development and the argument therein. So, James, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thanks for having me on the podcast. Look, it goes like this. As a practicing lawyer for many years, I learned the value of deep context in understanding an issue or a problem. And as an historian, which I am more fully spending more of my time on now, the same issue arises. You can think of that issue, the importance of context. Perhaps one way of reminding ourselves of its importance is the deep historical knowledge that Henry Kissinger used to demonstrate when he was trotting around the globe in the 1970s, engaging in a large number of tasks, including, of course, the separation of the Soviet Union and China for strategic reasons and the recognition of China. He had a deep historical knowledge. He was born in Germany himself and studied history when he went to the United States as a refugee, etc. Sometimes people who lack historical knowledge and understanding find it more difficult to contextualize present events. And I know, Nick, that that's something you've touched on often in your podcasts. So for me, the question of how did the American Constitution come about is really a vitally important question for all of us because of America's importance in the world. I'd say particularly for its importance for the part of the world that is, freer and more democratic, but for the world as a whole. And America wasn't built just on the basis of the group of people who were living in a particular place at a particular time. It was built largely by immigration to a country that was underpinned by the Constitution. It's of really vital importance. So when I read or hear about the Constitution was just conceived at the Philadelphia Convention in 1787 by the group of people in that room, many of them remarkable people and very learned in and knowledgeable about Republican government and constitutions to the extent they had existed at that time, because the American Constitution was the first major modern constitution. So there were not the depth of constitutions out there that can be looked at now. But when it's written as though it was just handed down from on high to this group of inspired geniuses, it obviously is a story that lacks authenticity. And that is part of a narrative of American exceptionalism, which I personally think is not helpful for us to properly understand the origins of America. I think some of the turbulence we see in America today is about a reaction to that exceptionalist narrative. So what I've tried to do is give, as you said, a longer sort of ramp to what produced the Constitution. And as you alluded to, I actually go back a bit further than the First English Revolution, the trial and execution of Charles I for tyranny, for betraying his own people by engaging in tyrannous government. I go back to the founding charters of Virginia and Massachusetts. And one of the things that you see from the very beginning, those founding charters, is that because of the logistics of communication across the Atlantic, when you were talking about sailing ships in the early 17th century, the local settlements there, they were very tenuous settlements initially, had to have a degree of local decision-making capability. So from the beginning, they had partial independence. And what the book explores is how that partial independence sort of grows over time, how it gets mixed with the Republican government that was the learning coming out of and the ethos of the Republican government that was established in England after the trial and execution of Charles I, and then how the Stuart Kings, Charles II and James II tried to push back on partial American independence, how that led not only to revolution in England, as what some people call the Glorious Revolution, but it led to revolutions in New England, Maryland, and New York. And then the development of, what should we say, constitutional government, where even in Britain there was an expectation that Parliament was at least a co-equal partner with the monarch. Wasn't quite at the stage of parliamentary supremacy, perhaps at that stage, but moving generally in that direction. And how that reinforced, if you like, the ethos of significant local independence in America, and how all that is part of the platform for the events of the American War of Independence, the American Revolution, and the Constitutional Convention in 1787.
In a way, for quite some period into the build-up of the outbreak of the American Revolution, there was nothing inevitable about it. There was still significant numbers of American colonists that viewed themselves as Englishmen, and there were numbers of people who thought, well, some sort of arrangement with England, with Britain is necessary, but actually breaking away and forming a republic, or forming some kind of separate state, because the final model of a republic wasn't settled for quite some time. That's not necessarily desirable. At what point do you think during that it becomes inevitable that there would be that there would be a separate state, probably a republic, governed by a constitution?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Not until very late. So the momentum starts to build from 1763, when the British government, significantly in order to help it to deal with the enormous debt that it had taken on in what was really a global war with France, the 7 Years' War, which was fought, a fair bit of which was fought in North America, but not all of it. It was also an oceanic and naval war, etc. So from 1763, the British start to say, well, hold on, these colonies of ours, and we've just fought this war partly to defend them from the French and from Native Americans. These colonies of ours are very lightly touched. They're contributing a bit to Britain economically through the Navigation Act system, which involved giving preference to British ships, etc. But they're not contributing much by way of tax revenue. We need them to actually contribute something to this enormous debt. And I have data in the book about the range of taxation on people in the American colonies compared with people in Britain. And it was, huge. Like from memory, people in Pennsylvania were paying something like 1/20th of the tax that people in Britain were paying. And even the most highly taxed people in the American colonies were still paying only about 1/5 of what people in Britain were paying. So you can understand, if you're sitting in Westminster and you're looking across at these Britons in North America who are prospering well, they had higher incomes than people in Britain, that it seemed entirely reasonable that they should contribute to tax revenue. But for various reasons, this didn't go down well in America.
No.
And from 1763, momentum started to build. But it wasn't until quite a while after that that it started to become anything like inevitable.
Because there was quite a resentment in America about I was reading recently about the number of kind of copies of the Magna Carta that were being printed in the colonies at the time. I don't imagine particularly faithful copies of it, but sort of somebody, some scholar writing out the rough approximation of what the Magna Carta said. And these were circulating around because you're in an age of mass printing and growing literacy. People looking at this saying, well, I view myself as an Englishman. I happen to be on the other side of the Atlantic, but I don't appear to have the rights of other freeborn Englishmen back home. The question of taxation is like nimbly avoided there, because people will very often look at find a sense of grievance without perhaps looking at the other side of the argument. But that's just us as a creature, really, I think. And there was this sense that because of the lack of representation, mainly, we are in some ways second class Englishmen. There's a lot of really interesting literature written about the development of national consciousness and national identity. And the classic book is Imagined Communities by Benedict Anderson, which is a fantastic book. Particularly, he writes about this kind of weakening of relations between what he calls the metropole, which is the imperial centre, England or London, and the colonies, and how it is over a long period of time colonies acquire their sense of difference, the sense of differentness. And when you're looking at the American Revolution, I always get the sense that it's that sort of imperceptible quality of different generations growing up, having never seen this England that we hear so much about, and seeing themselves gradually, bit by bit, not as English so much as colonists, and then perhaps even as this thing that we would have thought of at the time as American. Do you get a sense of that from some of the things you've read?
Yes, absolutely. And it's interesting. I've already mentioned that because of simply the logistics of communication in the 17th century, communication across the Atlantic, that a degree of local decision-making was inevitable in the colonies from the beginning. So they already see themselves as having, and they soon have formally established local representative assemblies. And these assemblies, by the way, they're at the level of each colony, but even more so at the town levels. You have significant local, significantly autonomous local government at the town level. So the colonists do become accustomed to a high degree of autonomy at the town level and a moderate degree of autonomy at the colonial level. They're not initially taxed, because part of the deal is, the English colonial model was initially somewhat influenced by the Spanish colonial model. So the Crown reserved to itself a percentage of any precious metals mined in the colonies. But as you know, the Atlantic coast of North America now it wasn't Peru or Mexico. There were not precious metals mined there. So they were lightly taxed. Now, had the colonies failed, and of course they nearly did at the beginning, there was starvation and terrible suffering amongst the colonists. Had they failed, of course, they would have been more likely to value the close ongoing connection with Britain, because they would have been looking for support. But as it was, once you get to the revolutionary period, they're successful. As I said before, their incomes are higher than the incomes of people in Britain. Incomes vary quite a lot from New England through to the southern colonies. There's a lot of variability and cultural variability within the first 13 colonies that became the first 13 states. But still, they're succeeding. So ask yourself the question: you live in a community where you have a high degree of local autonomy and a low degree of tax, and these people from across the ocean, whom you acknowledge have had a key role and still have titular sovereignty over you, and you've adopted their system of law and a whole bunch of things that have helped you to become the freest and most prosperous part of the world at the time, in the case of the colonies. And then they start asking you to to pay them a bunch of money which they hadn't previously asked for, that might influence your perception somewhat. And then when you have people who were deliberately agitating towards independence, slowly people start to imagine the possibility of an alternative way of arranging things.
Yeah.
Over this somewhat extended revolutionary period from, let's say, 1763 to the time of the Constitutional Convention, 1787. I mean, that is, after all, at least a full generation, that revolutionary period. It's not overnight.
Yes. Well, I think it's always important, whatever revolution you're talking about, French, American, Russian, what have you, to think in terms of revolutionary periods, and what it is that is an interesting question, I guess, is it what it is that brings revolutionary periods to an end when a new established sort of status quo emerges. And I suppose in America, in some ways, the revolutionary period almost goes up to 1865, because the nature of the state that emerges, which has a federal government and state governments, is a kind of is conflicted, particularly over the question of slavery and states' rights, all the way up till the end of the Civil War, when the answer about who is in charge, the verdict is given. So revolutionary periods can be sort of quite an elastic concept, I suppose.
Yes, well, with the drafting of the Constitution in 1787 and then its adoption in the following year and the beginning of the new government, I would say personally that the revolution is settled, but what is not settled is how the system of government will work in America. And in that sense, as you say, it's if you like, the execution of the structure of the revolution that continues for quite a while. Yeah. And you could say, of course, in some ways it's still today a work in progress. And this is one of the wonderful things about representative government within what is, at the end of the day, a fairly broad framework. The Constitution isn't obviously definitive about specific policies. It sets out an architecture, and what happens within that architecture is a lot of will no doubt continue to change. But the issue of slavery, to which you refer, is a very interesting one, of course, because not only of its because it led to the Civil War, but because of what happened subsequent to that and is still happening in America. And it's very interesting because at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the North was, and by the North I mean, of course, the Northeast, was already strongly opposed to slavery. It was effectively unconstitutional in Massachusetts as a result of the terms of the state constitution, which had been adopted since the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And other northern states were moving towards prohibiting it. There was a lot of, many people had the view that at least the importation of slaves should be terminated, and that subject is dealt with specifically in the Constitution, where a grace period up to 1808 was allowed, but it was recognised that it might terminate after that. One of the things that might surprise someone coming to this for the first time is that even slave owners from Virginia were conflicted over the institution of slavery. Some of them spoke against it as an institution tending to degrade morals, and not just being oppressive to the slaves, obviously, but degrading the morals of and the work ethic of the whites. So it was really, the further south you went, the more entrenched support for slavery became, and it was particularly strong in South Carolina and Georgia. And one of the things that's easy to overlook when one is considering these issues in the context of the Constitution is that states like Virginia, their slave populations were considered to be mature because the children of slaves unfortunately became slaves themselves. There was no perception of a need to import more slaves there. all this changed somewhat when the cotton gin was invented very shortly afterwards, and the Napoleonic Wars led to enormous demand for American cotton. And then there was a rapidly increasing demand for slaves after the Constitution was adopted. Mm-hmm. At the very end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century, which somewhat changed these dynamics. But at the convention itself, the Constitutional Convention, was quite conflicted over the question of slavery, but they recognized that it was impossible to achieve the Union if slavery was immediately prohibited, or even if the importation of slaves was immediately prohibited, because Georgia and South Carolina were very clear that they would not join the Union in those circumstances.
Mm-hmm. So there had to be the framers of the Constitution had to work with the realities that they had. Essentially, they had to offer concessions in order to draw the slave-owning states in. There was one way in which I've often perceived the way Southern states looked at the Union was it was to many in places like Carolina, the Union, they didn't really anticipate it as being a kind of a state. They more anticipated it as being a kind of a useful federation if, for example, predatory European powers turned up like the British or the French. And at that point, it kind of made sense to band together and to act in unison. But by and large, the idea of ceding control to a central government wasn't really what they'd signed up for. Do you get a sense of that, or?
Yes, absolutely. And to put that in a bit of context, so when the states came into existence with the Declaration of Independence in 1776, it's very important. Everyone's in America, everyone was focused on the individual colony level, if you like, and those colonies becoming independent and becoming states, if you like, mini republics. So you have 13 republics down the Atlantic seaboard there. They're definitely not thinking of replacing what they've convinced themselves was the tyrannical British monarch and the tyrannical British Parliament with a new, potentially tyrannous American president or king or parliament or Congress sitting over the top of them. Absolutely not. But they have to carry on the war. And the truth is they did a pretty bad job of providing resources, both men and finance and equipment and supplies to the American army. And of course, if the French had not joined the Americans, the outcome of the war may have been rather different. Mm-hmm. But the structure they adopt for the purpose of cooperating, as you say, in matters of national defence in particular, and in this case, defence against the British, was they adopt a legal structure under a document called the Articles of Confederation. Mm-hmm. And in the Articles of Confederation, the states themselves as sovereign entities are represented. The citizens of the states are not represented. And the central government, if you like, almost too strong a term, of the Confederation has no power to tax. So it sort of sends invoices out to the states from time to time, which the states often ignore. Mm-hmm. It asks for them to supply men for the war effort, and those requests are often ignored. When the British finally come to enter into a peace treaty with the United States and recognize the independence that they've effectively, the colonies are lost, the preamble to the peace treaty is very, very clear. It lists 13 separate states, and it says these United States viz, and it lists the states. So it's not even acknowledging the existence of a unitary United States. Yes. In the peace treaty, where it recognizes the independence of the 13 former colonies. And this is a big issue. and what happens in the period between the the Declaration of Independence and the establishment of the sort of Confederation government and the drafting of the Constitution in 1787 is that it becomes obvious that the Articles of Confederation in the system is too weak, and it's not providing sufficient benefits it's not working. But then that still gives rise to the question you raise. So, okay, we're going to need a stronger federal government of some sort. But then there are, and some people want to leave it at that the cooperation will be around, let's say, international trade, defense, security, treaty-making powers, things of that sort. But others see it as both a federal government, an overarching government, overarching the states, but also a national government where the government will have its own allotted powers, including a power to raise revenue across all the 13 states. So it'll be a part national and part federal government. And that's a contentious issue. That's the model that ends up winning. But as you say, many people had in their minds much more a looser federal government, not a federal and national government.
Yeah, and it's a kind of a curious hybrid of circumstance. And I might be wrong, but I don't think that there was an equivalent in the world at that time. I can't imagine that there was anywhere. Bringing things slightly forward, I mean, I think we'd be remiss to be talking about the US Constitution and not talk about really the last 6 or 7 years of American life, really, because irrespective of where one stands on kind of Trump or Biden or whatever else, the US Constitution has been placed under immense pressure, huge pressure in the last, since 2016. Would it be your view that it has emerged stronger, or has it been compromised, or what are your thoughts?
Well, I suppose two of the areas that one thinks of for recent years are the appointments to and the somewhat political nature of the Supreme Court. And that system is different from the system in Britain, of course, where appointments are not made by political administrations. And the question of the extent of state representation rather than popular representation, which is reflected in the structure of the Senate and the Electoral College. Now, I live in a metropolitan city, and people tend to think in that city that counting heads for the purpose of the electorate is the way to go, and that people in smaller states should not be, if you like, disproportionately represented. But in very big and very diverse countries like the US, perhaps Canada and Australia, and one could wonder how diversity is managed within somewhere like Russia too, but we won't go there because that's an entirely different constitutional tradition. The question of representation of the states as sovereign entity within the federal national government is always going to be contentious. If it's a federal government, then they should be highly represented, and the underlying electorate should not be just one vote per person, because it's effectively a union of states, not of citizens. But then, to the extent it's a national government, then perhaps it should be of the citizens. And this is where that fusion of the two models, national and federal, that we talked about before, it becomes alive, right? In the structure of the Senate, where each state gets two senators, no matter the population, and in the Electoral College, where the number of votes in the college is the aggregate of the number of votes for each state in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, which obviously then has a bias towards the smaller states.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, I think it's inherent in the federal national structure of the government that the smaller states are, if you like, or a single individual elector, individual voter in one of the smaller states has more influence in the composition of the Senate and the Electoral College than someone in Los Angeles or New York. It seems to me that when people speak otherwise, they're forgetting the partly federal nature of the system of government. As for the Supreme Court, well, I don't really have anything to elaborate on that. Once the decision was made that appointments would be made by the president, it follows that the appointments would be politicised. Sure. Is that able to be undone? Could you do in America what happens in, say, Britain, where it's not such a politicised project? I don't think you could unwind it, because people would say, well, that makes it less representative. So you could say that one way to view the contentiousness of these appointments is that the structure of the Constitution implies the possibility of political appointments to the court.
Mm-hmm. And you have, particularly since the January 6th insurrection, or whatever you want to call it, you had a president in Donald Trump who was pretty explicit about his willingness to not abide by a rules-based system. I wouldn't even say the law, because some of the aspects of the US Constitution as it applies to the powers of presidents rely on this idea, and the same is true in Britain, even though we have an unwritten constitution here, that you will have the honourable guy, the person who's willing to work within a set of given parameters. And obviously, Trump, you might be forgiven for thinking is the first exception to the rule, but you could argue that Nixon before him and various dodgy things that happened under Reagan with the Iran-Contra affair, and I'm sure there are numerous other examples. There have been presidents throughout the last couple of hundred years who have bent the rules, but I don't think have disregarded them to the extent that Trump has. Do you think that the Constitution has successfully constrained him, or has it failed in parts?
Yes. We'd better add at least one Democrat to that list.
Yes, please, let's do that.
FDR was threatening to talk about politicising the Supreme Court.
Yes.
He was threatening to completely stack the court.
Yeah.
Look, I personally have pushed back on a couple of occasions on naming seeking to characterise January the 6th as a coup, partly because, and I think a riot or possibly an insurrection is a better term, because there was, if you think about what you'd have to do in order to pull off, in order to deny the proper the installation of a president who was duly elected in America, and to pull off a proper coup, it would be prodigious. And Trump was nowhere near, right? You'd have to somehow corrupt not only a mob and, let's say, some members of Congress. You'd have to corrupt the military, the Supreme Court, the police forces, and you'd have to do that not just at the federal national level, but across many of the states as well. And I think you're right. His apparent contempt for not only, as you say, not only rules but norms was, shocking. And but was he ever really a threat to the proper functioning of the Constitution? I don't think so. I mean, not only was he nowhere near corrupting all those institutions, but they were almost all extremely hostile towards him. So I think that it proved that the Constitution is resilient and still works effectively in its objectives, which are to establish a system, not to and then to allow the participants in that system to police one another through its famous checks and balances and areas of, if you like, tension that are built into the system. I think it was all extremely shrewd the way that was constructed. I think what it shows is this. It's very interesting. Actually, many people in that room in 1787 had quite a romantic view about, in particular, the Roman Republic, and they kept harking back to that. They'd read a lot about it. They were very well versed in it, and they did have this idea of the virtuous citizen. And Washington was seen as being the virtuous citizen who had given up much to serve as the leader of the American forces in the Revolutionary War, that it became apparent in, let's say, the first 20 years of the Republic that the model of the virtuous citizen was a bit idealistic and not particularly aligned to what were not entirely democratic policies, but politics, because the electorate didn't include all free men. There was a property qualification in most places, and of course it didn't include women or slaves. But the ideal, let's say the founding ideal, was the president as a virtuous citizen. And you look at the distance that we've travelled when we end up with a sort of, I don't want to use the word deranged, but an extremely unconventional narcissist like Donald Trump. It's a long way from the virtuous citizen model.
Yeah.
But the structure is still holding up and it's still resilient. He didn't manage to corrupt the structure as far as I can see.
No. Well, thank you so much, James. We'll finish there. That was a wonderful discussion. Really, really fascinating. Now, just to do a quick plug at the end.
It's upside down.
Two Revolutions and a Constitution, how the English and American revolutions produced the American Constitution, available in all good bookshops. And I will be doing a giveaway. I was kindly sent this by the publisher, so I'll be doing a giveaway, and I'll be putting a question on the blog. Check it out, and we'll get this copy out to you in the not too distant future.
Thanks. Nick, may I just interrupt very briefly? Sorry. In particular, it's being distributed online. So in particular, through the online distribution channels.
Okay, fabulous. So that's where you will find them in all good online retailers. Thank you so much, James. And I do hope you have time to pop back in the future and talk about the Constitution history again, because it's really fascinating stuff.
Thanks, Nick. It was a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much.